Hello, we're now going to talk about prevention measures, a really important topic. Honestly, all of our videos up until this point in LO4 at least have led up to this topic because ultimately we want to protect our assets, and that's what prevention measures do. So they aim to reduce risk, and the fancy word for reducing risk is mitigation. So reducing the risk of an asset being exploited in an attack. And the way you do this is generally trying to protect a vulnerability. So you know you've got some weakness and you're trying to protect it in some way. Prevention measures are both trying to stop attacks, so fully protect that vulnerability, and also make things not quite as bad if the vulnerability gets exploited. And it's not necessarily the focus of our video today, but it's worth repeating my personal view, and it's a common view in security, is that humans are often the biggest vulnerability there is, because humans are pretty gullible. You know, we're quite susceptible to falling for social engineering attacks. Humans are quite trusting and don't always trust people too much occasionally, whereas computers of course don't. You know, you can't fool a computer. You can exploit some software bug maybe, but you can't fool it like humans can. And to mitigate against humans being stupid, training can be really important. And it's rare to get an exam question where you can't talk about training, where someone is explaining what staff should be doing. They shouldn't be replying to phishing emails, they shouldn't be clicking on links without checking, and so on. Trying to increase staff awareness and increase their knowledge. They may not have knowledge of cybersecurity. It's important they know the basics, and so won't fall for social engineering attacks. Okay, so we're going to now look at more measures and split them into physical and logical prevention measures. First of all, physical measures protect the surroundings of a computer system, the computer system being the entire thing. Or you can look at it another way, you can look at it as the computer system being protected from the surroundings. Essentially, limiting access to the device. So the way you do this is with somewhat obvious prevention measures. They're not always technical. Things like having locked doors, having security guards, having CCTV, storing devices in safes. So this is a safe. You might want to lock your USB stick in here overnight when you go home, just to try and limit access to your computer systems. And biometrics can feed into this. Biometrics are measures of human characteristics, essentially aspects of humans which we can measure. So we can use these in access devices. You will be familiar with things like fingerprint scanners, iris scanners, maybe iris scanners. So your iris is the coloured bit in your eye. Irises are unique, fingerprints are unique unless you have a twin, identical twin. So you can use these in scanners and at doors. So maybe instead of a key, which can be just stolen, you use an iris scanner which is unique, and no one else apart from this person can get in. So you can mitigate against identity theft by having a biometric control which should be unique pretty much to humans. Facial and voice recognition may be a little bit less accurate, but can still be used to limit access. So biometrics are a little bit technical, but they're not the most technical, generally speaking. You know, they are the physical things which stop people getting in. So logical measures are a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more IT related. So a logical prevention measure protects the running of a computer system. So the actual workings of a computer system, like the system vulnerabilities, these are trying to protect the system vulnerabilities. So authentication can be used to limit access within the computer system. I say within because what I mean is limit access when you are on the computer as opposed to around the computer. But you can't obviously be within a computer, literally speaking. So authentication is where we are checking your identity. So making sure the person is authentic. They haven't stolen an identity, they haven't faked their identity. So logging in with username and password is a really simple way of authenticating people. So you have a username, you have a password. Nowadays, we might have, or companies start to use what we call two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, shortened to 2FA if it's two. And this would require two pieces of evidence. So password is one bit of evidence. Only you should know your password. It's why you need to have a strong password, which can't be easily guessed. But you might also want a second piece of evidence. Often certain logons now will they'll send a code to your phone and make you put in the code as well. That's the second piece of evidence because, you know, only you should have access to your phone, right? It's all about checking you are who you say you are. And the more pieces of evidence you require as part of your authentication system, the less likely identity theft will be an issue. But the more trouble it is for your normal users. And very much related to this idea of authentication is the concept of access rights. So access rights are given to user accounts to determine what they can access on the computer, what they are able to do on the computer. So, for example, in many operating systems, we have administrators, which are different to normal users. So the administrator has permission to access various system files, whereas the normal user doesn't. So often you'll try and do something on a computer, especially at school, I imagine, and it'll give you an error message. It will say you need to be an administrator to do this. Various things like your school teachers can do, which you probably can't because they have access to more stuff. Beyond that, there will be IT support workers at your school likely you have access to stuff teachers don't have that access to. It's all about trying to limit access where you don't need access. If someone who is very low level at your company has got access to all of your core files, that is very risky because they could be an attacker. And we need to have authentication to have access rights because otherwise you wouldn't know who's who. Another really important logical measure which you hear about all the time, or you probably do, which is separate to access rights and authentication, is encryption. So encryption uses a secret key to convert data into an unreadable format which only authorized viewers can decrypt and read. So whenever you go to a website, and if in your search bar it says HTTPS as opposed to HTTP, often they get rid of it in the actual URL, but you might have a lock next to it on your browser. This is Chrome. That means you have that website has been downloaded with an encrypted web page. So it means your web page was kept secure between your computer and the website's computer or website server. So YouTube in this case, no one on the internet could tell I was on YouTube because it was encrypted between my computer and YouTube server. So let's talk about this a bit more because it's really important and really it's quite a complicated topic. Honestly, at university you could go into this a lot more. So files can be encrypted on computers not just over networks, but often we think about encryption being done over networks. But in terms of your files, this might manifest itself in having a password protected file. Occasionally you'll open a file and it will say enter a password for access. That file has been encrypted. You need to put in a password, which is the key, to access the data. And ransomware works usually by encrypting all the files on your computer, and you can't decrypt it because you don't know the key, and the idea is you pay the ransom to the attacker and they'll give you the key to decrypt. Doesn't always work like that. But let's talk about networks, because what is important to appreciate is that encryption doesn't stop an unauthorized user intercepting the data, but it does stop them reading it. So interception is where you read data in transit, so between your computer and somewhere else. It gets sent from your computer and someone could read the data on its way. And mid-video I changed that word to understanding because really they can read it, but they won't be able to understand it because it's gibberish essentially. So let's say we've got Alice and Bob who are trying to communicate. Alice wants to send 12345 as a message to Bob, just an example here obviously. Both of these are legitimate users, they're perfectly fine. So if Alice doesn't want this to be intercepted as it gets sent from her computer to Bob's, anyone could theoretically read the data being sent, especially if you have, say, an insecure modem. A hacker could have access to it. All the data goes through the modem, they could read it. So say Alice wants to encrypt this message, she might use a key of 2, and Bob needs to know the key as well, which can be an issue because the key needs to get sent to Bob securely, but he needs the key to be able to decrypt it. But Alice will then send the message, she'll apply the key. So in this case, the key is just adding to the message. In real life, it's much more complicated. It involves a lot of maths. But let's say we're just adding it, so 1 becomes 3, 2 becomes 4, and so on. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 gets sent. Anyone could intercept this, but only Bob is able to decrypt it and make it go back to normal because he knows the key and he knows the opposite of what Alice did. If we've got someone like Eve, who is ironically eavesdropping on the message, she'll be able to intercept this message and read it, but it's why I changed it to understanding. She won't be able to actually understand what this means because it's not the same as the original. Now, of course, in reality, this is much more pronounced. It will be a normal message, which is totally ruined. Here, they're just different numbers, but in reality, it's a lot more obvious. But she'll be able to understand it even if she can access it. It's the same idea with files which stay on your computer, except that they're not sent, but they can still be read, especially if you've got, say, spyware on your computer. And you just lock them with this key and you can decrypt it when you want to because only you know the key. Okay, last few measures to talk about. These are all measures which the exam board could talk about. Still talking about logical measures. So backups are really important in terms of mitigating. So a backup is a copy of data. So if you've got some data which is important to you, creating a backup, creating a copy is really important because if you have an attack which destroys your data or modifies it or manipulates it, it's going to affect you quite massively unless you have a backup you can always restore and go back to normal. And clearly these need to be kept as secure as your primary source, otherwise the backup could get hacked instead of your primary source, and they should be kept separate. So say we've got 2 hard disks, and let's say we've got one as your primary source and one as your backup. Primary is your main data, the backup is for copy. Clearly, if you have them right next to each other, on the same network say, that's not much better, because if one hard drive gets affected, there's a good chance the second one will be as well. Say there is a flood and it damages your primary source, if they're in the same room, it's going to affect your backup as well. So ideally they should be kept separate and kept off the same network as well, because a worm, say, could spread across a network. It's also important to obviously back up regularly, especially if your data is changing. If your data has changed a lot, your backup might be really, really old and not particularly useful to you. And finally, to prevent malware from being a big issue, antivirus software is really important. You should install that on your computer. Many computers will have some antivirus software built in, but it's not always amazing. So antivirus software, its whole job is to scan your computer, so look through your computer for suspicious files. Trying to detect malware is its first job, and its second job is to then remove it, if it finds it of course, remove it from your computer to stop it becoming an issue. And one final point which is really, really important is antivirus software should be updated really often. Every time an update is available for it, it should be updated. Often software is quite irritating by constantly reminding you about new updates. Often it is important, because even if it's not antivirus software, there could be a bug in the code which an update will patch and fix and stop being exploited. With antivirus software, the idea is it's trying to detect the latest malware. Malware is developed all the time, different types of viruses, different types of worms, and unless it's being updates being downloaded from the internet and installed, it won't be able to detect and mitigate against the latest malware. It needs to know the latest details, and so it needs to download these and update.